Hi everyone who's just joined. I'm waiting for people's audios to connect. Thank you very much for joining.
Launches for Blenrep in multiple myeloma, for Trelegy in asthma, and new indications.
We have Tamlin, we have Lisa, we have Catherine, we have Leo. Thanks all for joining. We've only got an hour, so I'll go straight in. So hello everyone, welcome. This is an hour-long discussion around the future of diagnostics. So before I hand over to Emmanuel Labat, he's the head of the research business at Cytiva, and he'll be moderating the discussion. Some housekeeping information from me. My name's Sophie White. I think I've met all of you before. I'm the communications manager for the research business of Cytiva. So first thing to note is this presentation is being recorded and will be available on demand in our online virtual diagnostics summit, which is taking place today. And there's details of which I'll share with you at the end. So members of the media, I see you've joined, welcome. So when we get to the Q&A, you'll have a chance to briefly introduce yourself and your publication. So for now, as you are, please keep yourself on mute during the discussion. There are 3 ways to ask a question. Firstly, you can write in the public chat on Zoom. Secondly, if you prefer to verbally share, you can raise your hand using the hand icon. And once prompted by me, you can come off mute to ask the question to the panelists here. And finally, if you want to ask a question anonymously, you can send me a direct message. So we'll pause for questions twice during this session, so please make sure you send them in early. And finally, it's worth noting that our panelists are all here in a personal capacity, so the opinions they express are their own and may not necessarily represent the views of their company. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Emmanuel Labat.
Thank you, Sophie. I hope you can all hear me well. Thank you for joining, and particular thanks to our 4 panelists for being with us today. Before we start, maybe a bit of the background here. I mean, obviously, the past couple of months have been unprecedented from a lot of perspective, and certainly for the diagnostic industry. With a massive amount of stress, I think we've seen an incredible response. But at the same time, obviously, areas and opportunities for learning, and that's what we hope we cover today. So, the panel here, we've tried to regroup really members of the panel here that have a great diversity of background and experience, and you will hear more about what they do, what their company do, and their insights to this very particular year as we go through. And in order to get us started, and before we go into deep dive questions, just going to do a quick lightning round. I'm going to ask each of the panelists their key takeaway from this year. And maybe David from Cepheid, if you don't mind starting.
This is Dave Fursting from Cepheid. Yeah, I think the main point of what I'll be sharing in the session is examples of how the diagnostics industry can respond quickly to a new threat, but also how we need to be considering ways to adapt more quickly in the future and be better ready, as well as we did for introduction of diagnostics quickly. We can do better, and we need to do better. And so preparing for the next pandemic is going to be an important endeavor after this wave passes.
Thank you. David from GeneDrive.
I think for me, key learning this year was that you often hear business leaders talk about the importance of a shared vision and goals in a business to get everybody rallied around and accomplishing. And I think our experience is probably shared by a lot of people that it was sort of easy to do this year. All of our R&D teams, our commercial teams, really rallied around a cause that everyone understands. And although I agree with David that we can do better, I do think it's pretty amazing as an industry what we've managed to do this year, all sharing a common vision and cause and reason for being.
Thank you, Dave. And the third Dave of the panel, and you didn't have to be called Dave to be part of this panel, but it just happened so. So David from Avacta.
Diagnostics Dave.
Yeah,
I think for me the key thing this year, and I've been in the industry nearly 30 years, and I truly believe that this is the first year that diagnostic testing has been recognized and has truly been valued, not just for its role in tackling the global healthcare pandemic, but also in general. So I think finally diagnostics has been recognized, and a strong diagnostics industry is going to be the focus for many governments as a key strategic asset going forward. I think the other, just to highlight what Dave and Dave have said as well, being as a developer of SARS-CoV-2 antigen test, we feel again uniquely that we're in almost an infinite market opportunity, and that's really changed the basis of competition. So that spurred a lot more collaborative activity, a lot more open collaboration, effectively pre-competitive type behavior, which I hope endures beyond this pandemic. But the industry really has come together very well, not just together as companies, but with the other stakeholders such as governments, funding bodies, regulators, to really try and provide solutions that can help tackle the pandemic.
Thank you, David. Brendan.
My middle name is David, by the way.
Your middle name is David.
I think there's been lots of good lessons this year, right? I mean, I think specific to the point on diagnostics being recognized. I think now diagnostics has reached the point where it's not just something that people are going to go to Quest laboratory and get a blood draw done once a year and get meaningless results to them and then move on, right? So I think the industry's really crossed it and into a new frontier there where it's actually relevant to people. I think specific to the pandemic response, there's been lots of good lessons. There's been a lot of very human mistakes along the way as the industry has evolved and governmental responses have evolved. But it's been, I think, amazing to see the levels of collaboration that have come to the fore, both in private industry and in government industry partnerships. And to see people really think this through, we're technologists, we're product developers. But so it's been interesting to see people really think it through all the way to implementation, not just focus on the technology, but actually how this gets implemented in lots of different environments for lots of different purposes. I think there's still a lot to build on here. One of the things for us, is watching the infrastructure build out right now. And, I think that there's still lots to do there to make sure that the infrastructure that's been put in place for the industry is sustainable. Right, and that this response is actually replicable if it's needed in the future, and is maintained in the meantime.
Right, and I think that's going to be our first area of focus is infrastructure, because I think what we've seen at Cytiva certainly reflects everything you said, the collaborative spirit, the fast response to the challenge. But I think what we've also gone through and what the patients are seeing is there's been challenges in scale up and ramp up and capacity to deliver, and I think a lot of the constraints around supply chain. So just wanted to talk about supply chain for a couple of minutes and maybe start with you, Dave, at GeneDrive. I mean, any takeaways from how you manage your supply chain, expectations from your suppliers, things that you've learned that you would like to do better in the future?
Listen, I think the experience is probably going to differ from the size of your company and the robustness of supply chain. I mean, we've been working since March to develop two products. One with Cytiva, we worked on a ready-to-go PCR 96 well format that can sort of run on third-party PCR platforms. And in that format, having all the components together means that from a lab perspective, the workflow is straightforward. They don't have to prepare reagents. And then we are also working on a point of care version that you can do rapid testing from saliva when the patient's present. But I think that, you know, if I sort of think back to March, you know, the reality is you need to move very rapidly, right? And also we saw a worldwide draw on common reagents, enzymes, DNTPs, whatever, you know, antibody components, all sorts of things. So I think every company was, from a supply chain standpoint, in a similar situation. So I think we can see that companies that were able to respond quickly, first of all, leverage their existing technologies, right? Their existing supply chains, existing methods of working quickly. You know, they were able to repurpose what they had, and companies trying to develop things from scratch, you know, weren't able to do things as quickly. So I think for us, the key thing is that we lent on suppliers that we already knew, that we already had relationships with, that we had contracts in place, and I think also that we were confident in. You know, we knew them and we understood the quality of their products. And because we knew them, we had the relationships, we could sort of, you know, we could get in that sort of same boat together, you know, trying to solve problems, you know. So like in the case of our high throughput test with your team at Cytiva, you know, we generally worked on an assay together, right? Like our R&D teams got together and tried to figure out, you know, how to do this. And as I sort of intimated, you know, we'd worked with the Cytiva team in Cardiff for probably 5 years, right? So we knew the quality system, we knew the people, we knew how everything worked. So I think, you know, there are natural places that you're going to go to for supply chain. The other thing I would just comment, which is maybe a slightly different thing, is just the financial side of it. Again, for smaller companies, you know, we were put in the position, like lots of other companies, of having to really prime supply chains with cash, you know, to secure products for the future, which is difficult when you really don't know what demand and commercial execution is going to look like, you know, when you're literally right at the start.
And would you say, I mean, I think what we've observed here at Cytiva certainly is there was this massive demand in Q2, lack of visibility, a little bit of panic buy, to be very honest. I think what, you know, I guess the 2-3 things that we've been working on to make it better is, I think it requires a lot of transparency with your key customers to have better visibility. I mean, we've added capacity, right? Very clearly, very early on, we're still building it up. And I think, you know, what we are also deploying probably with a little bit more rigor than we had with the past is a program we call security of supply, where we really work really hard with our suppliers, look at dual source when needed. But I think, like you said, you know, trust our historical and build on our historical partner, but just add, I guess, more rigor in the way we manage our supply chain. So I think it's gonna, you know, I feel like we're passed through the crisis phase, certainly higher volume, but much more manageable. And I think there are learnings for the future. I think, you know, David at Cepheid, so you're leading the technology, you're CTO for Cepheid, you're also the CMO for Danaher Diagnostics. I'd like to get back to what you said very early on, which is the speed of development. And certainly, I think Cepheid was one of the first companies to have a test available on the market. Anything you take from that period in how this product was brought to market that could help for the future?
Yes, so I will echo what David Budd said about the leveraging pre-existing technologies. In our case, we were able to leverage the pre-existing work that we've done for our flu RSV test, and we just basically replaced the reagents for flu and RSV with those for coronavirus. But even with that, we still had some work to do, because in PCR, often the reagents don't always play nicely in the same sandbox. And so we actually had a fair amount of optimization work to do. And we didn't have the benefit of clinical sample access early on, so we had to create realistic mock clinical specimens with spiked material. And control material was actually one of the biggest limitations early on, because we couldn't work with live virus. We We had to work with a collaborator to get access to a facility to culture live virus. We also had to work with partners to come up with control materials that were non-infectious to be able to work with. But given all those challenges that sort of hit simultaneously, we were able to come up with an emergency use authorization over about a 6-week period of formal development, with about 2 weeks of pre-development work on the front end that started within days of getting the sequence of the novel coronaviruses. So all in all, a very expedited, rapid process. We had to organize some multi-center clinical trials in parallel with the development process. So as soon as the product was manufactured and before it was emergency use authorized, we had the test being used in 5 different laboratories in the US and several in Europe, getting data back from their current standards along with our data. And so we had confidence upon launch that this was going to work. But clearly a highly parallelized process for development and depending heavily on the pre-existing design and the pre-existing supply chains for the test components.
Thank you, Dave. Brandon, I mean, as the CEO of DCN, you actually help companies develop their assays. How do you balance speed of development with quality, and what have you observed there?
Well, I suppose, you know, the development happens on a spectrum, obviously, right? I mean, and I suppose the historical or the methods, I suppose, that have evolved for product development over the course of the last 30 years or so really depend on, in a heavily regulated environment, you know, tend more towards the less risky end of the spectrum prior to release. I think the one thing this situation has done, obviously, is shifted the point where we draw the lines in that spectrum, right? We're releasing products, or the industry is releasing products earlier in the development cycles, and it does come with risk, right? So it comes with risk from a performance perspective. It also comes with risk to the developers and the manufacturers ultimately, if there isn't an understanding of the fact that, you know, the gaps frankly need to be filled in, right? The assays, many of the assays on the immuno side particularly that were released early, obviously weren't terribly robust, didn't have access to good samples, didn't have access to good binding reagents, and suffered as a result of it. And I think it's still probably true that, you know, many of the assays that have gone through the EUA cycle, you know, may not survive a more rigorous regulatory cycle, you know, which is going to come back. You know, it's just a question of when. So I think that, you know, the lesson for anybody in this environment is, yes, circumstances are forcing us to launch early, and there's certainly a societal need to do so under the right conditions with the right product. But you know, there's commercial risk to that, and there's risk to good data. It has forced us all to look at our work practices, I think, and it has made us all a little more efficient as well. So there's definitely pros and as well as cons to the situation. So you know, there's a lot of good product in the market now too.
Right. Thank you, Brandon. Sophie, do we want to pause for questions, maybe?
Yeah, let's pause a second. So I just want to give the people from the media and the time chance, if you want to come off mute, and if you have a question here. We've covered, you know, the big topics of the year, which is all about COVID and supply, and also the development challenges, so speed of development, the pros and cons of that. So wonder if anyone has any questions in regard to those topics or anything else.
Hi, Sophie. It's Tamlin Oliver at BioCompare.
Hi, welcome.
So Dave Persing said at the beginning that he was thinking about preparing for the next pandemic, and I wondered if you could expand on that.
Yeah, I think it's going to be increasingly important for test developers and designers to build in what I would call broad range capability to cover more than the target of current interest. This is probably more possible with nucleic acid tests than it is with antibody-based tests, where it takes a lot of work to find the antibody that cross-reacts with multiple pathogens within a group, but it can be done. With nucleic acid testing, it's very possible to identify regions of viral families, essentially, which are conserved among all members of that family. And so I think the focus of the next round of development activities should include at least a component of building broad range capabilities, so we are not left completely unprepared in the context of the next pandemic. It is entirely possible to develop a broad range target for all of the SARS, BAT, beta coronavirus family members. So if SARS-CoV-3 emerges, we'll be ready with at least something that will tell us that a novel SARS coronavirus is present. That's possible to do with pandemic influenza as well. It's possible to do with the MERS family of coronaviruses. And yet there are still important gaps that we need to prepare for, which is to prepare for disease X, for something we really have not seen before. Examples would be Nipah virus that came close to being a pandemic a few years ago, with high degree of transmissibility and a high level of mortality. So having a measles-like transmission pathway combined with an Ebola-like mortality percentage is a horrible thing to contemplate. Nobody has, to my knowledge, an assay ready to go for Nipah virus. So building in capacity to allow systems to be modified more quickly, building inventory so that third-party reagents can be combined and deployed to run on available existing testing capacity on a decentralized basis to meet local needs of a local outbreak would be an important element of getting ready for the future as well.
Great, thank you, Dave. And I believe Leo has a question on the line here from 360 Diagnostics, so I'll let him go ahead and ask that question.
Thanks. Hi guys, Leo from 360DX. So I'm really interested in this whole area of asymptomatic testing, and how important it could be to helping all of us, everybody, the whole industry in the world, mitigate the pandemic. And then, if it is vital in your view, what's it going to do to demand, and do we have the capacity to actually do enough testing of asymptomatic individuals? So I'd just like to hear your thoughts around that area.
Well, maybe I can start. Leo, yes, I agree. I mean, really what we really need to do, we need to have the capability of testing everybody, and testing everybody frequently, because at the moment it's mostly people with symptoms or symptomatic that get tested. And I know in some countries, such as here in the UK, you can't actually get a test unless you are symptomatic. So it's the ability to be able to test everybody as frequently as possible. And I think we're going to come on to this later in the discussion. What testing format can enable that? What tests can be made available at that scale? We're talking about billions, literally billions of tests every year. So a test that's good enough to detect infectious people, it doesn't necessarily have to detect all infected people. The ability to test frequently gives you some compensation for a lack of sensitivity, for example. But as long as you're accurately detecting those that are likely to spread the disease. So that really then speaks to a massive demand, a demand that we can't currently satisfy at all. I mean, current manufacturing capacity is orders of magnitude lower. It is being scaled up, but I think the lack of capacity to manufacture tests in those numbers is actually the biggest challenge that we face to enable that approach.
And I think we'll get back to that maybe, David, on that manufacturing capacity, especially for the UK. But maybe just building on that, on the question. I mean, Brendan, you're also in the space of rapid testing. I mean, any thoughts to follow up on Dave to answer Leo's questions?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with the need for the test. It's likely to be essential to reopening. I think, again, one of the things we have to consider is obviously worldwide demand. So we're not just considering first world cases in this instance. So creating the infrastructure to support that kind of production locally, internationally, in the places where these tests are going to be needed. It's a massive challenge, and it's something that we think about a lot. Obviously, is supply chain and quality of tests, but something I think gets overlooked quite a bit is actually the knowledge gap, and how we actually build the knowledge base in places where that kind of production can be supported. How do we train the people? How do we get people up and running on? It's one thing to put up a production line for 1 billion units or something. It's quite another to keep it running. So I think there are enormous gaps in the infrastructure from that perspective, not just from the materials and the equipment standpoint. So yeah, I think it's an enormous challenge, and it's going to be a multi-year project.
There's probably an element as well around who needs to be tested, right? I think the idea that we'll test everyone in the world once a week or something like that, we don't think we'll get there, right? But being a bit more targeted around transmission points or particularly vulnerable populations or people, I think is probably an area it'll end up in.
And as a follow-up,
yep, please, sure, go ahead, Leo.
Sorry. Yeah, so we've seen how important PCR testing has been to helping mitigate the pandemic, and now we've seen fairly recently some antigen-based tests getting EUA, and a lot more of them getting CE marking as well. So are point of care tests going to be really key to helping mitigate these circumstances going forward as well? And how important is that element, and how do you see the interplay between point of care PCR and antigen tests?
David at Avacta, do you want to take that question? That's really core to what you do, right? Yeah.
Sure, I can take part of it. So yeah, I think it's clearly PCR testing in a laboratory offers the most accurate, potentially the most accurate test, but it's very difficult to scale, and we can't rely on using PCR to give everyone access to a test, or however many people need to be tested. So if we did, then a lot of people just wouldn't get tested. So I think there's definitely a very significant critical role for decentralized testing, point of care, PCR, point of care lamp, etc. does play a role. And then as you decentralize that further, right down to individuals testing themselves, then that's where the lateral flow technology will come into play. So it's really what we're going to need is a combination of all the different test modalities, because they all have different applications and have a have a fit for particular use cases, as they're called in the industry, or settings. But all of them will be required to contribute to the testing capacity. Some will be, more appropriate in some settings than in others. Yeah, so I think there's a role for all of them. They're all complementary.
And Brendan, maybe on the readiness of those tests, right? Because like Leo said, I mean, some of them have gone through emergency approval in the US, some of them are CE marked. I mean, what's your assessment on the readiness of these antigen tests from what you're seeing?
I think that there's tremendous progress being made on the antigen side. There's an astonishing backlog in the FDA right now. I think that the number I most recently heard was 2,800 EUAs in the queue. And there's a decent number of those that are antigen based, and they're getting prioritized. So I think we're going to see more and more antigen tests coming through. I think where a lot of the focus is going now is towards self-testing and direct-to-consumer testing, particularly in developed worlds, interpretation of tests, data handling, data management, digitizing the system so we have good access to good data quickly. And that's where a lot of the development effort now seems to be headed over and above the assay itself.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you, Brendan. One of the topics that has been really high on the news back in the second quarter at least was this notion of bringing some manufacturing home, developing domestic capacity as a way to address a shortage of tests, but also, I guess, as a bit of a protective posture from in some places. Any thoughts about whether the domestic manufacturing has a future, will actually happen? Maybe I'll turn back to you, David from Avacta, if you have any thoughts on that.
Will it actually happen? Okay, well, I think we're doing, well, certainly here in the UK, we are doing what we can to make it happen. Yeah. So there is a very, very active engagement between government and industry to identify what needs to happen in order to establish a national, well, they call it a sovereign supply, effectively. So the country as a strategic objective, and I'm sure all countries have the same strategic objective, is to try and ensure that the supply of tests comes from a home source, and they're not reliant on any overseas supply of a critical raw material or any manufacturing capability. So there is a significant effort underway to build that home-based manufacturing capacity. Can it be done quickly enough and to the right scale? I think that remains to be seen, but the intention is definitely there, and that's been a very unique experience as a diagnostics company working in that process, because governments can bring things to bear that the companies themselves would struggle to much more quickly and at a scale that's not otherwise possible. So yeah, the intention's there. Is it achievable? I hope so. It's certainly a huge challenge. And what does it mean for someone like Avacta? So I just talked about the manufacturing, but if you think of the whole supply, like the supply of the test, I think in the short term it means, as a UK-based company, it means that we could potentially have a very big customer for our one or more of our tests, a customer that could take a substantial proportion of everything we produce, or even everything we produce, or nothing. So it's potentially a great opportunity and also quite risky. So it does lead to some interesting conversations on sales channels and so forth, and routes to market and commercial, and how we commercialize the test. I think in the longer term, what it does demonstrate is that governments have recognized the strategic value of a strong national diagnostics industry. They see the value of diagnostics as a tool to help tackle these global and national healthcare crises. And they also see the value in establishing and growing the industry so that it's better prepared next time to respond quickly and at scale for the next pandemic. And by the way, there are other global healthcare crises ongoing right now, and maybe not, they don't qualify as a pandemic, but things like antimicrobial resistance, the growth in that, diagnostics have a central role to play in how we tackle that. And I think that the recognition of that will also be one of the enduring legacies of the COVID-19 pandemic, is the role of diagnostics in helping tackle those sorts of crises as well.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from anyone on this notion of local manufacturing? Brendan, I see you raising your voice.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's something we've actually been very focused on for the last 6 months. So obviously the ramp to scale in anywhere where the infrastructure doesn't exist is long, and it's difficult. When it comes to the immuno side, certainly it's a difficult technology to manufacture at scale. So to greenfield new manufacturing capability in completely new environments is a difficult thing to do. One of the things we've been working heavily with the foundations on is actually this topic of how we take effectively a good set of SOPs for antigen assays or antibody assays and distributing them broadly to manufacturing entities with capability for manufacturing at scale for low and middle income countries specifically. And there's initiatives like the ACT-A initiative out of Europe that are spearheaded by FIND that are very much focused on doing exactly that. And again, it's not a simple thing to do. It's something that for other public health initiatives has been attempted through the years and hasn't been perhaps as successful as people might want it to be. But again, the environment's different now. I think the funding is there, the will is there. A longer term view is there, and I think there's an understanding now of I suppose what could happen again in the next pandemic, where there is a global response required and a very sizable proportion of the world's population is left without good diagnostics. So I think that will is there now, and I think there's a longer term view on it, and that's something that we're working on. We're actually making our assays available to those initiatives. So that they can be implemented in low and middle income country manufacturing environments, and helping with that process of training and establishing sites for doing that kind of production. So we don't imagine it's simple, but we're trying to learn from the mistakes of the past there too. Thanks,
Dave. Dave at Gene Drive, Dave at Cepheid, any other thoughts on that topic?
Not strong views. I mean, we do all of our manufacturing in the UK, so I guess we were already homegrown. I guess to be a little bit of a devil's advocate, I guess what I would worry about is, when and if we emerge from this, governments will be in debt, very much in debt from what it's cost to support this. And I guess if we wanted to have local manufacturing in every country, the ideal thing would be that it made commercial sense to do that, and it would exist already. And I think one of the reasons it doesn't is because it doesn't make commercial sense. It would need to be supported financially. And so, to Brendan's point, I think, will there be a longer term view, desire, drive to support that? And time will tell.
Yeah, this is Dave. Cepheid, for Cepheid, the manufacturing challenges are unique because of the high degree of integration and automation required to manufacture our test cartridges. The test itself is very simple to run, but all the complexity is inside the cartridge, and that requires integration of both lyophilized and wet reagents, along with plastic parts that had to be sonically welded, and the expertise required to do that is limited to 2 locations in the world, in Sunnyvale, California, in Silicon Valley, and at our site near Stockholm. So when we have a sudden requirement for additional manufacturing capability, it comes at the cost of increasing our shift coverage for our existing facilities. And beyond that, we would have to build a new facility to be able to scale. So there's sort of a ceiling to what we can produce for our technology, and that can only be met by expanding facilities and manufacturing equipment. We actually have to manufacture our manufacturing equipment. So the lag time in getting to scale in a new facility is such that it just can't happen quickly. Despite throwing massive amounts of money at it, it just can't happen quickly. So I think our challenge for the future is to expand manufacturing organically into other countries to provide local manufacturing capability, but that will take time, and hopefully we can leverage that in the future should this happen again, but it doesn't happen quickly.
Thank you. I'd like to maybe move to preparedness, which we touched on a little bit earlier with you, Dave at Cepheid. Dave at GeneDrive, any thoughts on preparedness for a possible future pandemic?
I guess it depends on what the pandemic is. I think Dave Persing made a very good point that I think in the nucleic acid, the PCR world, again, depending on what it is, we're reasonably well equipped to be nimble to deal with these sorts of things. When you move to other technologies, it does become more difficult. And I think, preparedness, I think we've all demonstrated that we can do things faster, that we can take more elements of risk in our business. And I hope those things stay within how we operate. I would like to see probably more nimbleness in regulators. And I'll make that at a global level, because I think some regulators have been great, but clearly they're all overwhelmed. Brendan commented about EUAs at 2,800 in the queue. I mean, it's an astronomical number, isn't it? So I think it would be nice in the future to see maybe some of the more streamlined regulations that have been put into place, whether there's an opportunity to keep some of those things in the future, and just for general working. But ultimately, there's an element of luck in all of this, right? Are you in a company that has a technology that can be applied? Have you got the supply chain? Have you got the capacity? Even if and again, maybe Dave Persing might want to comment. If you need to change all your manufacturing to deal with something, it means you're not dealing with something else, right? And the ability to just scale up and logarithmically produce more overnight is really a challenge. But I think we've all learned a lot now about what we can do faster and more nimbly.
Any other thoughts? I mean, Dave, anything you want to add back to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way of saying it. That for a company that has a portfolio of tests, meeting the shifts in demand and adjusting the production capacity to accommodate those shifts is very important. And so like virtually every diagnostics company, we saw major shifts in demand toward COVID and away from things like tuberculosis and chlamydia and gonorrhea. That will come at the price of public health challenges in the future. It'll come at the price of increased drug resistance, increased complications of sexually transmitted infections. But everyone saw drops in demand for those tests, and that did create additional capacity for coronavirus production. But now that we're back to needing to meet the needs of those other conditions, now we're faced with increasing demand for those mainstay tests that were in our portfolio on top of the coronavirus capacity that we have to meet. And I think it's important to maintain flexibility in that, and also to be able to realize that the next time this happens, and we're probably going to see the same phenomenon, we're going to see a shift in all the focus and attention of shifting toward testing for the new pandemic and away from chronic conditions, lifestyle-related conditions, and that the attitude will be, well, those can wait, but they can only wait so long. And you know, the frequency of viral load testing for HIV can only wait so long. So, bottom line is that there's also some accommodation on the public health side that needs to happen as well, and we hope to be able to meet those demands as they shift.
Thank you, Dave. Sophie, should we pause for question?
Yes, I'll open the floor, and if anyone has a question, they can unmute themselves and ask. I thought we got a lot of interesting info there about, you know, improving access and possibly things that were going to be neglected in favor of COVID. So I have a question, but I'll first open it up to see if anyone else does.
So I just have a question about this whole concept of serial testing to help mitigate some of the concerns with the sensitivity and specificity of some of the rapid tests. Is that something that's likely to be implemented more? It seems like a good way to go to improve performance, but we're not seeing a lot of it done. So I just want to get your views on, is that going to be important, and why aren't we seeing more of it, if it is?
You know, in the case of coronavirus, I think it is going to be important to supplement the lower sensitivity of the antigen test with more testing. But I think you're right that the actual implementation of that increased frequency is far more challenging and far more difficult to implement than originally appreciated. Theoretically, if you have a test that is good at telling you that you are infectious now, that's important information, but it also indicates that others may have been exposed prior to getting that test result because of the possibility of infectivity being present for perhaps days prior to getting that test result. So nucleic acid tests are probably really good at identifying the first possible signs of infection. Maybe within 2 days after exposure, we'll see evidence of nucleic acid test positivity, and that would predict 2 or 3 days of further incubation to the point of becoming infectious. So there's an intervention window that you have to work with before you need to act on that test result. That window is much shorter for antigen tests, and it's going to be really valuable for short-term window prediction, like getting on a 4-hour flight, for instance, or getting on a 6-hour, getting involved in a 4 or 6 hour sports event, for instance, in a crowd. But the bottom line is that it needs to be used for what it's good at, and in order to make it good at detecting infectious cases with an adequate intervention window, it has to be done frequently. And I think that's where we're seeing the shortfall right now, is that there may be almost an assumption that if I tested negative, that I'm good to go and I don't need to come back. And it may be a compliance issue. On the patient side, well, I just tested negative yesterday. Do I really need to get retested? These issues will come up, I think, relative to test frequency.
Thank you.
Great. Any more questions here?
Let me just make one comment on that was referred to earlier. I think one of the indirect effects of COVID is going to be on coming up with better tools for dealing with sepsis. Never before have we realized in the medical community that viruses can cause sepsis. We've known that the sepsis docs have known this for years, but it hasn't been widely appreciated that any severe viral infection, whether it's influenza, RSV, or coronavirus, can cause a sepsis-like presentation. And so I think one of the indirect effects of COVID is going to help us justify improving diagnostic tools for managing sepsis patients, especially presenting in the emergency room setting. And so we're likely to see a lot of that play out over the next couple of years, that we will actually see significant benefit in coming up with better ways to stratify patients coming in with sepsis-like presentations.
So, thank you, David. Sophie, any more questions? I think we're getting to the top of the hour, so maybe we'll start wrapping up.
The end, so I think go to the lightning round. Yeah.
No, I know. I think so. Some of the takeaways, and first of all, thanks a lot for joining. Thanks to the 3 days and Brandon for your insights. I think we talked about the response of the industry, the capability, and what the industry has demonstrated as being willing to partner and work together. We talked about leveraging and repurposing existing tools to go faster in the future. We talked about localization and closer to home manufacturing is a possibility, but needs certainly the guidance and help from governments and organizations to help bridge the economic challenge that is there. We talked a lot about the mix between PCR and rapid testing and the need for more rapid testing, but in good combination with the PCR-based test. And I think great discussion on preparedness. How do we have broader range of assay maybe readily available, but also challenges that goes with any pandemic of that sort. What I'd like is maybe go back and do another final lightning round for anything that anyone would like to add, any further learning, anything we have not covered for the future. So maybe I'll go back to you, Dave. We'll do it in the same order. Dave at Cepheid. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think that, getting back to the point of getting ready for the future, it's going to be increasingly important to develop sort of universal diagnostics capacity that can be adapted quickly to a new pandemic threat. And with nucleic acid testing, we can do that. We can actually stockpile universal cartridges and universal reagents and adapt those quickly to the new targets. And I think that will really help us be able to respond more quickly. But we have to think creatively about how we do this and what we need to get ready for.
Dave at GenDrive.
I think for me, the lasting changes are going to be just around the recognition of the diagnostics industry, within government and finance, business, general public. I mean, my sort of local social media groups, people talk about PCR testing, and whoever would have thought that ever would have happened, but there's clearly a much higher level of interest, of investment, a focus on the industry and the industry players, and I think that can't be anything but positive.
Dave at Avacta.
Yeah, nothing new really to add to that. I'll just finish where I started. I think the fact that diagnostic testing, the value of diagnostic testing, is now acknowledged as a tool, a critical tool for tackling these global crises. Also, the recognition of a strong industry, national industry, as a key strategic asset, I mean, the UK government actually said that one of the reasons they felt that they were slower than some countries to respond was because they had a weaker diagnostics industry, and they've explicitly stated that they want that to change, and that what will come out of this will be a stronger diagnostics industry. So I think that will be a very positive and enduring legacy from this. And also to reiterate what Dave Budd said, it's just a unique time when you pick up national newspapers and listen to the national news on TV, and people are talking about test specificity and test sensitivity and predictive values, and it's never happened before. So I think the industry's finally come out of the shadows of the other healthcare sectors, and should hopefully benefit from recognition of the value that it really does deliver.
Talking about testing at the pub in the evening, right?
Yeah.
That's the new thing, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Brandon, final thoughts, please.
We know the difference between PPR and PCR. That's
we hope. But I think with that, I suppose with that new focus, I suppose, on diagnostics as a thing of importance. I hope out of all of this, there will be some degree of patience learned, and that in the responses, both from government and from industry, that people follow the science. And I think going back to the question on sequential testing, it's a good thing to stop and examine the use cases relative to the capabilities of these tests, right? And for antigen tests, no matter how sensitive they are still much more likely to give a false positive in a low endemicity environment than give a correct answer, right? So to their use off-label, if you will, in places like airports and train stations and things like that in Europe, which is happening now. It's an understandable human response, but I hope ultimately out of this a little more understanding of the science will trickle out into the broader world and into the governments as well. I think that could be a very valuable thing in the long term.
Thank you very much, Brandon. Thank you all. With that, Sophie, do you want to take it back?
Yes, thank you, everyone. So if we didn't get to your question, or if a question occurs to you after we hang up here, then do get in contact with me and I can work to get you an answer. If you want a follow-up discussion with any of our panelists, again, work through me. I sent a link on the chat to our Diagnostics Virtual Summit, so it takes 5 minutes to register if you want to go deeper on any of the topics that we discussed today. So I wish we could have got together in person for this discussion another time, hopefully with some strong testing behind us. So I hope this has been insightful for you all, and we at Cytiva look forward to working with you going forwards. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Sophie.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.